All right, let's get started then. Well, first of all, thank you for being here. My name is Alberto, and I teach Infographics and Data Visualization at the University of Miami. I've been there for a year now, and really glad to be here. It's the first time in Gainesville. I'm really enjoying the experience so far. Mindy mentioned the other day, yesterday actually, that the weather was not very good, but when I got here, I noticed that it was not as warm as it is right now in Miami, something that I really appreciate. And so I get to actually wear this hood. It's actually funny that they mentioned the hoods in the previous panel, because I usually wear these kind of things, even when I am in class. I'm pretty informal, as you can notice. Well, I renamed the presentation a little bit. If you compare the name to the one that you will see in the program, you will see that I have introduced some changes, because originally I was going to talk a little bit about that book. Actually, there are a couple of copies of the book running around the room, so if you want to take a look at it, just go ahead and take a look at it. But I decided that will be extremely boring, because if you want to know about the book, you can just go to the website, see what it is about, and that's it. So I decided to change the presentation and bring more content to the table, and other things that are not necessarily closely related to infographics, but have to deal more with journalism in general. Because we are talking about technology here, we are talking about the visual presentation of information as well, but there are other things that matter to me and that worry me about the current state of journalism. Just to give you a heads up, I obviously will talk about data visualization and infographics, because that's my area of expertise. And my definition of infographic is actually quite simple. An infographic is a visual representation of information, of evidence. So you have some evidence that you gather somehow, and that you aggregate and you put together and you analyze it, etc. And you do that to let readers analyze that information, to communicate with them, and also to help them understand a particular issue. That is what an infographic is, just a graphical representation of information. So diagrams, maps, graphs, illustrations that convey information, that comes under that big, broad umbrella called infographics. So actually, if you take a look at that definition, I highlighted two different words that matter to me a lot. The words representation and the word evidence. All right, so those are the things that I would like to talk a little bit about today. And in the first part of this presentation, I will depart a little bit from infographics themselves and talk a little bit about things that matter and that worry me about how we deal with evidence in journalism in general. I am not a scientist, I am not a statistician, I'm not someone who was trained in those areas, although I like to read about them. But even though I read the newspaper every day, I watch the evening news, I read magazines, etc., and I see so many mistakes that could be solved just by having a little understanding of what evidence means, that it really worries me that we are not teaching that at school. Just something that I tell my students at UM, I speak like a machine gun. So, we are in a small room right now, so at any point during the presentation, don't wait until the end of the presentation to ask any question or make a comment. Just raise your hand. I'm seeing everybody here. I will see you eventually, so I can stop and address any question that you have at any point. All right, so let me just focus a little bit on evidence before I talk about infographics. Probably many of you have seen this on Twitter already. Well, first of all, as I said before, throughout the years I've become concerned about how we deal with evidence in journalism, and also how we teach evidence in school, what evidence is, and how to deal with evidence. All right. So I want to say that probably some of you have seen that on the internet already. That graphic that basically correlates Internet Explorer's usage versus the murder rate, and everybody laughs. Everybody says, "Ha ha ha ha!" Yeah, I would never fall for that one. I would never fall for that one. That is too silly. A correlation between murder rate and usage of Internet Explorer. That is a preposterous correlation. But if you read books such as this one, I love recommending books to my students, because we are in a technology conference. But one thing that we should do in journalism school is to encourage students to read books, because they don't read books anymore, and as many as they can. Well, if you take a look at books like this one, you will see that journalists ask, We fall for things like homeopathy. We fall for things like the supposed connection between autism and vaccines. We bite those baits too often, and that reveals, or we try to teach, or we try to talk about the two sides of the controversy, which is that something that people that are against science talk about a lot of the time, and try to push us toward teaching the two sides of the controversy in the case of evolution. Well, we should not do that, because it's not our job. And our job is to uncover the truth somehow. Our job is to present the evidence and actually explain that evidence to our readers. So why do we fall for these things? It may have to do with the way we teach things at schools, or the way we face our own work. And actually learning about all these comes before you learn about visualization or infographics, etc. Yeah?
I just said thank you.
Thank you for what? For saying that. For saying that? Yeah, because, it's just, I get angry when I read a story related to those topics. Or when I read that book, for instance. That is an excellent book that deals with that, that deals with those things. Well, this is a graphic that reveals how badly we deal with evidence, all right? This comes from a Brazilian publication. I am originally from Spain, but I worked as a manager, as an infographics and multimedia manager in Brazil for a couple of years before moving to UM. And this comes from the most important news magazine in Brazil that sells 1 million copies a week, so it has a huge influence. And they published this story that basically says, well, the title says, it got worse after the zero alcohol law was approved. Well, this was a law that was approved by the government, trying to stop the number of deaths in car accidents, etc. And then they published that infographic in the middle of the page, showing you that, yeah, sure, I mean, the number of deaths in traffic, the number of car-related or vehicle-related deaths in the traffic has not stopped growing from 29,000 back in 2000 to 40,600 in 2010. This is pure crap. This is crap, and it's a bad use of evidence. And you don't really need to be a statistician to understand why this graphic is wrong, do you? That is the reaction that I get from my students. And it actually reveals that we are not learning how to deal with numbers in schools. Well, what is the problem with that? This is like if you don't adjust for inflation when you are talking about wages, because you are not taking the number of cars into account. You are not taking the population into account. Well, it took me 5 minutes to destroy this story completely. I went online, I went to the census, I downloaded the data from the number of cars, I divided the number of deaths by the number of cars, and I multiplied the number by 100,000, and I got the number of deaths in traffic per 100,000 vehicles. And the result that I got was that graphic. So the number of deaths have stopped growing. That is what we should do. And you don't need to be a statistician to do that. You just need to learn a little bit about the statistics, about the basics of statistics, about the basics of evidence, and about the basics of the scientific method, which is something that we don't really, students think that the scientific method is something that people in labs do, but the scientific method is just a systematic way of thinking that everybody can learn. All right? So doing that is our job. Doing that is our job as journalists and as infographics designers in my case, because I am both a journalist and an infographics designer. So our world, this is a quote that comes from another book that I usually recommend to my students, although it's a very controversial book, called Griftopia, by Matt Taibbi, who is a reporter at the Rolling Stone magazine. Our world is not about ideology anymore. It's not about opinion. It is about complexity. And our job as journalists, regardless of if you are a journalist who writes or a journalist who draws, in my case, or who create graphs, is to deal with that complexity, to tame that complexity somehow, using different tools. If you don't have the conceptual tools to deal with that complexity, then you're basically screwed. We need to teach those things at schools. We need to teach the right skills to learn how to do that. Are we teaching students to teach that, to tame that complexity, to deal with complexity? I don't think so. that we are doing a good job because of stories such as that one, or the things that you can read in books such as Bad Science. Moreover, this is important. We talk about storytelling a lot, and we talk about storytelling too lightly. And there are dangers in storytelling, very serious dangers, and shortcomings in storytelling. Are we really sure that we understand what the challenges and the limits are when we deal with the storytelling? Because many people distrust storytelling as a tool for conveying information. Perhaps not people in journalism, but people in science distrust storytelling for several reasons that I am going to outline in a minute. Now, that said, I am a storyteller, so I use storytelling. That's one of my graphics, one infographic that I produced when I was working in Brazil that deals with several issues related to Brazilian population. It uses data, etc., and it tells a story based on those data. So it has a headline, it has an intro that I wrote, it has a map, several line charts, etc., etc., etc. So it tells a story. But many people out there, not only scientists, but also regular readers, distrust storytelling for very good reasons. One of the reasons that specialists distrust storytelling is that if you try to learn about storytelling, try to do that, go to Amazon.com and search for storytelling to find books that deal with storytelling. Those are the books that you will find. Books that highlight words such as power, impact, captivate, convince, inspire, persuade, connect. Where is depth? Where is accuracy? Where is precision? Those words are not mentioned in the subtitles of those books. Those books are just about persuasion. And you may say, well, those are not values that we embrace because we are journalists. And my answer to that is that, have you seen the evening news lately? You have, right? So we do embrace these values, and we do care about these values, and perhaps we should care more about accuracy when we storytell. Don't teach just storytelling. Teach about the shortcomings of storytelling or the dangers of storytelling, because we can get captivated by storytelling just because we have a tendency to do that. Our brain is prepared to embrace storytelling because our brain is a storyteller. We understand things because we put things sequentially. We create stories in our mind to understand stories better. But as books like that, like those prove, this can lead to a lot of different mistakes and biases and shortcomings, because we can tend to see connections and causation where you only see correlation, which was a problem with the murder rate Internet Explorer thing that I showed at the beginning. So we should show students how to fight against those things, against those shortcomings and those biases, those cognitive biases that we have in our minds, that have been embedded into our minds or built into our minds by evolution. Because we tend to impose linear structures to what doesn't have a linear structure. Many people remember this guy, probably, all of you probably have heard about this thing. But when he was criticized, when his book was criticized, this particular book was criticized, I believe that we focused on the wrong issues, because everybody focused on the fact that he had made up quotes, but that was not the main mistake that he made. That was not the main sin that he committed. That is the main mistake, in my opinion, that he committed. And it is actually very common to narrative journalists and to people who try to weave together scattered pieces of evidence to build a wonderful and eye-catching story. And maybe we shouldn't do that way. We should be more careful with the way we weave or we saw those stories together, those dispersed bits of evidence, as I mentioned there. That was his main sin, in my opinion. And it is very common in journalism. Just read a Malcolm Gladwell's book. It's the same kind of book. Maybe he's more careful with that, but he commits the same sins, in my opinion. So we should be more careful with that. At the same time, we cannot avoid storytelling. And those are a couple of wonderful books about why we cannot avoid storytelling. This presentation looks like a book, like a sales speech or something for those people. I don't get any kind of payment from those authors, okay? Those are wonderful books, all right? And they actually explain that we cannot flee from storytelling. So we have to find a way to balance the fact that the storytelling can be dangerous and unreliable, etc., with the fact that we cannot flee from storytelling. We have to use storytelling. So we have to actually teach the students the tools to bridge that gap in between the dangers and the fact that we cannot avoid is storytelling. So perhaps, and this is the message of this part of the presentation, we need to rethink the way we teach research methods, classes, for instance, and the way we teach storytelling in our classes. Maybe we need to teach less theory because students are not able to bridge the gap between the theoretical part of the research method class and the real world. They are not able to do that. Maybe we should bring more real world cases to our classes. Maybe we should teach less that bullshit that follow your instincts. I don't trust my instincts at all. At all. Double check your instincts. If we're teaching our students double check your sources, well, you are a source. Your instinct is a source, so double check your instinct. Be careful with that. And above all, make statistics and qualitative methods fun, because the statistics are a lot of fun. So why do so many students think that the statistics are boring? Maybe it's perhaps it is because we are not teaching them the right way. We are not teaching the statistics the right way. And very importantly, learn and teach about cognitive biases. So get thinking fast and slow. The famous book by Daniel Kahneman, because that is a wonderful book that teaches about that. Or get The Invisible Gorilla, which is another book that teaches about biases, etc. Read about all those things and then try to bring those things to your classes and teach your students about the shortcomings and limits of storytelling. All right? Enough rant. Now comes the part about infographics. Representation. Now there comes the second part of the equation, of the definition of what infographics are. Visual representations of evidence, of stories, in order to let readers analyze, understand, and let us communicate with them in some way. If you search for best infographics on the web today, the kinds of things that you will find are like that. And I love to bring these up into presentations because it's a perfect example of a bad infographic, not a good infographic. Because that is not really an infographic, that is just a visual presentation of random data and unconnected data. The problem with that presentation is that it doesn't have a structure, it doesn't have a context, it doesn't have a proper headline, it doesn't let you do anything with the data. It's just a presentation of numbers. An infographic is not just a bunch of numbers with a bunch of cute illustrations put together. An infographic is a tool where you get some data and you shape those data visually somehow in order to let readers extract patterns or see patterns and trends in those data. Well, you cannot do that in that infographic, in that supposed infographic, because it's not an infographic at all. An infographic should not be just a pretty picture. That is the most important thing. It can be a pretty picture because we should care about aesthetics, we should care about the use of type, we should care about the use of color. But first of all, and this is actually the way I'm explaining this thing right now, is the way I explain infographics in my own classes, exactly the same way. We should care first about the structure, about function, about what readers will try to get from the infographic. That is the skeleton of an infographic. And on top of the skeleton, you can put some skin, beautiful skin, tan skin over that. That is the aesthetics part of the infographic. An infographic is like a pair of glasses. All right? If I take my glasses out, I don't see anybody. I see a blurry mess. I see noise. All right? But this is my infographic. All right? If I put it in front of my eyes, right now, suddenly, part of that noise becomes signal. All right? So in some sense, I am using a tool that lets me see, a piece of technology that lets me see better, that lets me see signal where I only saw noise before. So that analogy can be actually applied to infographics directly, because if you see a bunch of random numbers, like a spreadsheet, or like an Excel spreadsheet, you cannot extract any value from those numbers. I mean, unless that you are a genius. Some people are able to do that. I am not. But when you transform those numbers into a graphic, all right, into a graph or into a map, into a chart, diagram, etc., suddenly you can extract that. So an infographic is a tool in a very literal sense. It's something that you don't really just see. It's something that you use, something that you manipulate in order to get information from something. And because it extends our visual brains, capacities, and skills. It let us see beyond what we would normally see in the world in front of us or in a bunch of numbers. That is the key idea that we need to teach when we teach infographics and visualization in a journalism school. Because many people, and I say this because I see it in many faculty meetings, many people from the word side of the AL think that design and infographics are just about using typefaces and fonts, etc. And that is not the right thing. Infographics are all about our information architecture. All right, and we share values with written storytelling. All right, when we, for example, when you write the outline for a story, I also write outlines for my own infographics. This is a different kind of a storytelling, something that the people in the previous roundtable addressed. Okay, so. That has consequences. The idea that an infographic should be a tool has a consequence. And this is actually related to the content of the book. This is the key idea of the book that I mentioned before. Before you switch the computer on, you have to think about, what do I want my readers to do with this infographic? And according to that, you have to shape your data in a way that lets readers extract meanings from the data. My glasses have a particular kind of lens that are adapted to my eyes. The same thing can be said about an infographic. A hammer has a particular shape because it has a particular function. So function and form in infographics are also closely connected. And we have to teach those connections somehow. Function doesn't necessarily dictate the form. All right, so for several functions, you can have several forms as well. But it restricts the variety of forms that an infographic that your infographic can adopt. And I'm going to show you a perfect example of that. This is an infographic by The Guardian. It was published by the Guardian Data blog, which is a wonderful blog about data everybody has heard about. And they published this infographic a while ago, put together with fusion tables, about poverty in the US, all right? And the data there is wonderful. I mean, it includes data about poverty, about lack of health insurance, about wages, etc. But the graphic is completely useless because of the way it has been put together. What can you extract from this graphic? What kind of messages can you extract from this graphic? Well, I can get probably that the poverty rate in the south is slightly larger than the poverty rate in the north, and that's it. That is a very shallow message. If I want to get deeper into the data, I actually have to click on each one of those, on each one of the states, and see that behind the map, there is a huge wealth of data here. So they actually tell, well, so many people live in poverty, that is the percentage of, that is the total percentage of population that compares to the US average in such and such way. So many people don't have health insurance, that is the total percentage of blah, blah, blah. You have the wages are, actually the income, the median income there is not wages. The median income there is such and such in 2009, is such and such in 2011. All that is not actually represented in the infographic in a meaningful way. What about if I am interested in poverty and inequality, and I want to compare Florida, where we live, with Connecticut? How do I do that? And with Texas? Well, if I want to do that, that is the task that I am trying to accomplish with this tool. This tool doesn't make things easy for me because it forces me to scroll down, click on Florida, see the numbers of Florida, memorize them, then go to Connecticut, click on Connecticut, memorize Connecticut's number, then go to Texas, open Texas text box, memorize those numbers. So, what is the message? It is a very inefficient tool because it doesn't let me answer basic questions that a reader may have regarding this data. So this is a perfect example of a graphic where the designer was not really thinking about the form related to the probable functions that that graphic should have. In favor of this graphic, I may say that they probably produced it in 10 minutes with fusion tables, all right? But what I mean is that by sitting down just for 10 minutes when you have a data set, you can come up with better solutions, with better ways of displaying those data. And actually what I'm doing right now, this kind of very fast critique of the graphic, is the first part of my classes. I send my students a lot of graphics, and I make them critique the graphics according to the questions questions that those graphics should be answering, or should be, helping me answer as a reader. Okay? Related to that, everybody loves bubbles today, and I love to talk about bubbles, against bubbles actually. This is a redesign that I made of a graphic made by the New York Times a while ago, showing how much you would save if federal income taxes were cut by 20%. And the graphic actually displays, I erased the numbers in purpose, so you would not see the numbers in there. There were actually numbers besides each one of those bubbles. So the bubbles actually represent the amount of money that you would save yearly, every year, if you are in each one of those quintiles of the population. So you can see that the top quintile will save a lot of money compared to the fourth quintile that will save less money. Okay? That is basic. Now, what about if I show you just one number and I say, well, the fourth quintile will save $1,600 a year. How much money the top quintile would save? Nobody knows. What is the proportion between those two bubbles? You cannot know. So the graphic is useless. It is totally inefficient. All right? Because we are not good. This is one of the reasons why we should be teaching more cognitive psychology in journalism in school. The human brain is not good at comparing areas. The human brain is good at comparing a single magnitude, either length or width or height. Okay? So if you want, and this is a task, this is the way we should create graphics. Before you create the graphic and start creating bubbles and stuff that look great on the page, I will concede that, they look wonderful, but before you create the bubble, you have to sit down and say, all right, what is the main task that this graphic should facilitate? To let me accurately compare a bunch of numbers. Well, the key word there is accurately. Bubbles are not good at letting me accurately compare. So let's try to use a bar graph or a dot plot. And when you encode the numbers using, well, those are actually the numbers. When you encode the numbers using a bar graph, take a look at that. The difference is striking. That is the amount of money that you would save. So actually, besides being inefficient, it is also misleading. You are misleading readers. Go ahead.
But aren't those bubble sizes calculated?
Yeah.
So I don't feel like the bubbles are misleading.
They are misleading. Well, could you tell the difference before when I hit the numbers?
Well, yeah.
Can you tell the difference?
I mean, I feel like I can see as easily that the fifth quintile is saving a ton.
A ton. But can you say that it is 4 times the previous bubble?
Take the numbers off the bar.
But here's the thing. That is a perfect. That is what I wanted to go. If you need the numbers, what do you need the graphic for? Just create a table and save some space.
Okay, that makes sense.
If you don't, if you represent the numbers, is to have that. But that is a perfect question. That is a very good question, because a graphic is something that should be self-sufficient in some sense. Not entirely. You may need the numbers to understand the information better, but it should be self-sufficient. If you represent the numbers proportionally, the numbers should be accurately represented. And the bubbles don't let you see that the fourth bubble is 4 times the previous bubble. You can tell that it is larger than that, of course.
But do you think then, I get that. Some are going to understand the numbers. I think, for me, the bubbles work well, but the combination of the two is perfect.
It is not, because it forces you to read the numbers to understand the story. Whereas if you're absent-minded like I am, you represent the numbers like that. I don't really need to read the numbers. I can say, wow, that is a huge difference. And 80% of readers, there's actually, I forgot to mention that, there's actually research about how most readers read bubbles against bars and bars against pie charts, etc. And most readers will see the difference much better seeing the bar rather than seeing the bubble, without reading the number, because that is the key thing. Because if you need the number to support the comparison, as I said before, then the graphic is completely unnecessary. All right, the thing is, are bubbles always wrong? Because that is the other related question that I usually have in this presentation. No, bubbles can be right in some contexts. Bubbles are very good, for example, at showing when you have a map, a huge map with tons of different regions, and you have to display, a lack of health insurance or unemployment rates or whatever it is. You have big bubbles here, small bubbles here. So if you have to display just the overall pattern of things on a map, bubbles are perfect for that. Because on a bubble map, your goal is not to compare one bubble to the other. It's to see where big bubbles are versus small bubbles, which is what you were saying. But when the goal is to accurately compare things, most of the time, a bar graph or any kind of graph that actually is based on a single baseline, zero baseline, usually beats the bubble graph in every single case, I would say, in every single case. So what I'm saying is, all this comes down to, I don't want to focus just on bubbles. It all comes down to sit down, think first about what you want readers to do with your graphic. An infographic should not be used just to simplify stories, which is another thing that we hear a lot. This is an idea that showed up in the 80s with USA Today, that graphics were a way to make information more fun because readers don't read anymore. Well, if you don't believe that readers don't read anymore, I would recommend you to look for a different career. Readers read, and I'm a newspaper reader, and I get the newspaper every day, and I read it, and I read the New Yorker, and I read books, and I'm a reader, and I buy, and I pay for it, all right? So readers love to get rid of this. So infographics are not just a way to simplify stories. Infographics are a way to clarify the stories. This is something that I borrowed from a very famous graphic designer called Nigel Holmes, who actually mentioned that sentence to me, and I used it in the book. And I'm going to show you an example of graphic that, in my opinion, simplifies information without clarifying information. Of course you have to simplify information because you cannot show it all. But you should clarify. Clarify should be our main goal. Actually, it comes from USA Today. All right? This is one of USA Today's snapshots. You know there's a graphic like that size, etc. It's from last year, and it's flight cancellations between 2007 and 2010. So we had 160,000 cancellations in 2007 and so many in 2010. And when I saw that graphic, I said, well, so what? Because it's actually related to what we saw before. So what? Are those many flights? I don't know, because I don't really know what the base is. I don't know how many flights are flown every day in the United States. So show me the percentages. Or show me the economic impact of that fact. Or show me. The meaning is clarify the story. Go a little bit deeper into the data, into the information. Don't just show me numbers, because numbers are meaningless by themselves. So give some context to those numbers somehow. And instead of wasting your time drawing a beautiful airplane, which is something that you can do, obviously, as well, if you have enough time. But try to spend some time clarifying the data and completing the data, giving me a more complex or a deeper view into the data. And this is what many designers do. And this is what many instructors who teach infographics in journalism schools do, in my opinion. They focus too much on the technical side, how to use the pen tool, which is a tool that we use in Illustrator to draw those kind of things. To draw the airplane, that is something that I teach, by the way, in my classes. But before, make your students think about the numbers and think about what the numbers mean, what the headline should be, what the deck should be, what the intro should be, what the labeling should be. Those are the most important elements in an infographic. And after that, let them draw the plane if they want to, all right? Because they probably need the plane anyway, because they want to attract readers. But that comes much later than that, all right? So, 3 steps to become a visualization designer. Some of you know that I'm teaching a MOOC right now with 5,000 people, only 500 or 1,000 participate, about infographics and visualization through the Knight Center in Texas. And in that course, I try to, and in my own courses at the University of Miami, I try to convey several ideas. The first one is that anybody can learn to do graphics properly. I'm pretty successful and pretty beautiful infographics and visualization. That is the first thing, because my approach is completely low-tech. All right, the people in the first panel were talking about programming and scripting and processing and JavaScript D3, and that, you know, that scares people away. All right, you can create pretty successful visualizations using Excel if you know how to use Excel properly, or OpenOffice, which is something that I prefer because it's open source. But anyway, or Illustrator for that matter. All right, so you can create very beautiful visuals. So low tech, think about low tech first. And the other thing is that if you want to learn or you want to teach infographics and visualization, there are actually three steps in that process. The first one is critiquing infographics, which is something that I have done so far. So try to think about if a graphic gets the message through, if it tells a story, if it lets you go deeper into the data, etc. That is the first step in any training or self-training program in creating infographics. That is the first step. The second step, which is also important, is to start making infographics. Use Excel, use OpenOffice, use Illustrator, or use a pencil and paper and try to encode data or numbers or phenomena in visual form. All right, try to educate yourself in doing that. It's not that hard. And actually in the book, I describe how I came up with the idea for the book cover, where that graphic came from, that strange-looking infographic that you have on the front cover, where it came from. Well, it came from one of those exercises. When I'm reading the newspaper or the New Yorker, etc., and I see one of those stories filled with numbers and statistics, etc., and the story doesn't have a graphic, I feel itchy and I need to go to the computer and start looking for the numbers and try to create something about it. All right? And I remember that many years ago, I read a story, and don't ask me where, it could be the Atlantic Monthly or something, or Harper's Magazine, which actually had this idea that somehow the obesity rate is connected to the education rates. If you take a look at the data, state by state, and even county by county, the higher the education rate is in a state or in a county, the lower the obesity rate tends to be. Something that makes total sense, and the story described that. But as a journalist, I don't trust journalists. So I went online and I gathered the data to see if the hypothesis of the story stood or not. So I downloaded the data. I went online. This is actually something that, again, you don't need any training in statistics to do that. I just went to the Census Bureau and I downloaded obesity rate, state by state, and education rate. I actually used a proxy variable to that to stand for education rate. I actually downloaded the percentage of people who have a BA degree or higher, state by state. And I put those two numbers side by side. So on the first column, this is the spreadsheet that I used. On the first two columns, you have the obesity rate, state by state. On the second two columns, you have the people who have BA or higher, the percentage of people. You cannot really see anything in there, all right, because it's just a spreadsheet, okay? I actually calculated a couple of things there, something called the correlation coefficient. Many of you have heard about that, so I'm not going to describe it, but that isn't really helpful. So I started encoding the data in graphics and actually transformed this into a class exercise to show my students that in order to create a proper graphic, you have to go through several iterations in the process. You actually have to encode the data in different ways, in different graphics, and put them side by side and try to identify which one of them you like better or which one of them tells the story better. So first of all, I tried to encode the data using a bubble map. And the bubble map doesn't work. Because you have to have a very good eye to actually tell that if a bubble is slightly larger over here, it will be slightly smaller over there, and the opposite, and vice versa. Okay? The smaller is there, the larger will be there. You can tell, you can see, but you actually have to stare at the map and actually try to see that. So you cannot really tell that phenomena, those two variables, are inversely correlated using the bubble map. Or at least it's hard to see that. So maybe this is not the most appropriate graphic form to actually convey that idea, the inverse relationship. It is also not very useful to, for instance, I'm interested in health communication, and if I had to create a graphic like that, I could actually list a possible secondary task for this graphic, which would be, let me rank the states according to both variables. Who is higher in education, who is higher in obesity. So that graphic doesn't let you do that either. Okay, so it doesn't let you do anything. So I encoded the data, and believe me, I used a low-tech approach to create something like that. It took me 5 minutes to create that map in Illustrator. It's not that hard. I created a choropleth map. A choropleth map is a map that encodes data using shades of color. And here the message is slightly clearer. Okay, so the lighter a state is here, the darker it will be there, and vice versa. The darker is here, the lighter will be there. But again, I mean, this lets you see more or less the inverse relationship between those two variables. But again, it doesn't let you rank so it doesn't accomplish the two tasks that this graphic could have, or that this graphic could help with. So it's a little bit better, but maybe it's not the perfect solution. So I tried to encode the data a third time using a bar graph. Well, actually, it's a variation of a bar graph called a lollipop graph. That's pretty descriptive, because it's basically a bar graph where the bars are really thin, and you put a dot or a circle at the tip of the graphic. It looks lighter on the eyes than having hundreds and hundreds of thick bars on the page. So basically what you have here is the ranking of states according to education and the ranking of states according to obesity. So this graphic lets you rank the states and lets you compare the states, and it actually also lets you see the relationships if you have a good eye, because if you pay close attention at the lists, you will see that DC, for instance, is on top of the first list, and it is at the bottom of the second list, whereas West Virginia is down here on the first list, and it is up there on the second list. So this is a graphic that accomplishes those two tasks slightly better than the previous graphics. Okay, so this would be an appropriate way for encoding the data. Now, remember what I said before. Function doesn't dictate the form. Function just restricts the form. So are there other ways you could encode this data? Yeah, there are other graphics that could be equally successful at letting you see the connection between the variables and the comparison or the rankings between the states.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, it's going to require me some work to kind of decode that.
Yeah, it takes some time. You actually have to read it to do that. That's the reason why I try to encode the graphic using a scatter plot, which is another kind of graphic that you can use to encode the connections between two variables, all right? A scatter plot is not very common in the news, but it's a kind of graphic where you encode one variable on the horizontal axis and another variable on the vertical axis. It's a kind of graphic that is used by statisticians. So if you pay attention, if you try to learn how to read this graphic, you will see that the higher the percentage of obese people, the lower the percentage of people with BAs tend to be, and vice versa. The higher you are on the vertical axis, the left you tend to be on the horizontal axis. So that would be another way.
Question, though.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you have to learn how to read the graphic, isn't that a fail?
No, it is not. And that is another excellent question.
Right.
Very, very good question.
People don't know how to read this.
Graphics have not been around forever. Graphs were invented in the 18th century.
Yes.
Well, not really invented, but were systematized by William Playfair, who was an economist in the 18th century. Before William Playfair, nobody used bar graphs. And when bar graphs were first published, everybody had to learn how to read bar graphs. And it took 10 minutes or 15 minutes to get used to that. All right? So should we abstain to publish scatter plots just because they are uncommon? My answer is not. My answer is that we should use them. And if we are using them for the first time in a publication, maybe we could write a note here how to read this graphic. Because the next time that you publish a scatter plot, your readers will be used to reading them already. So not all graphics are self-explanatory at first. The first time that you encounter that you find a new kind of graphic or a novel kind of graphic, you actually have to learn how to read it. And that is the reason why, for instance, my kid, who is 7 years old at school, they are teaching him how to read bar graphs at school, at primary school, because you actually have to learn how to read that. Obviously, it's easy. It takes only 5 minutes, but it only takes 5 minutes to understand what that is, or 10 minutes if someone explains it to you.
Looking at the graphs, I mean, it's a great graph, but as someone was just saying, it takes time to process it. And we've been told that people don't, with websites, for example, people give them 3 to 5 seconds of that, then they move on. TV news is all flash and murder and mayhem, and so people seem to, and they want everything short and sweet.
Then don't write.
I'm not saying we should panic for the audience, but
how to make it more appealing?
I mean, this looks to me like a graph that people who are getting, a degree in whatever.
Obviously, yes, because it is not a graphic that I created.
Degree in public health, but not, average Joe.
That is an excellent point. It is not a graphic that I created to be published. It is a graphic that I created to see if the story that I was reading was right or not. If I had to publish something like that, and I have published graphics like that in the places where I have worked at, if I had to publish something like that, I would write notes, I would put a proper headline in there, maybe I would combine the graphic with a photograph. So you have to add more things to the graphic because you're not addressing a specialized audience. You are addressing a generic audience.
That's what it looks like.
Yeah, well, it looks like because I actually created it like that in purpose because I was not going to publish it anywhere. All right. So yeah, graphics need proper headlines. But that same thing can be said about writing. If you think about readers don't pay attention to what they read, then don't write long form stories because they don't read anymore. And we're discovering that if readers care about the topic that you are talking about, they will read your story. Well, the same thing can be applied to graphics. I am interested in health communication. My dad is interested in health communication. And as a reader, as a general reader, he will probably stop there. Now, and another thing related to that, even if you create the simplest graphic in the world about sports, I would never read it. Because I don't care about sports. So previous interests in the part of the readers really matter. All right? It's not that every reader will stop to read your graphic or your story. They have to be interested in that story beforehand somehow. Obviously, you can attract them using a proper headline, something that this graphic lacks. Okay? Very good. All right. Now, are there other ways to represent the data? Yeah, there are other ways. So I try to represent the data. Yeah, so go ahead.
Earlier you were saying you're not a statistician.
Yeah, I'm not.
I love this graphic, but I'm assuming for someone to create a graphic like this, they still need to have at least some kind of statistic courses, because this is a correlation.
Yeah, well, or read a little bit about the statistics. Actually, well, and this is something that I recommended my students to do the other day. I wrote a post the other day about books about statistics, really basic statistic books. And the latest that I read is titled Naked Statistics. It's a very short, equation-free introduction to statistical concepts, and it is wonderful. If you read that book, and it's 200 pages long, very easy to read, very attractive, you can understand that. And you can understand what a correlation is, or even what regression is in some sense. Yeah?
Well, what I hear you saying is, if you're talking about infographics in a class, undergraduate class, not only are we not focusing as much on the art at the beginning, because usually that's what we're thinking traditionally, is about making pretty graphics that are going to be art to break up the text on a page or on a website. What you're saying is, even in our undergraduate students, you mentioned research methods, this kind of scatter plot or any kind of statistics that
would be part of
need to
that.
be looked at on different graphs before you build your infographic.
That's exactly what I mean. So try to create different versions and see which one of them fits the data better, fits the story better, fits your publication better, because this is something that the New York Times will publish, but the New York Post will probably not publish. They will publish something that looks, prettier or more with more eye candy, etc. You have to think about the audience as well. Okay? Yeah, but that's exactly what I mean. Yeah.
For an introductory to journalism students, what programs do you recommend that they go across and test these different things?
Well, they can use Tableau, for instance. Tableau Public is very easy to use. Tableau, can anybody spell that? It's T-A-B-L-E-A-U-S. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So Tableau Public is a very good one. Google Fusion Tables also can work. So there are many options out there right now. I heard the other day that they are redesigning Many Eyes. Remember IBM's Many Eyes, which is a tool, an online tool that lets you create graphics very easily. You just input your data, and actually it comes with several buttons that represent with a bubble, represent with a bar graph, represent with a line chart, and you can actually compare which one of them. You actually can do that automatically without having to redesign the graphic. So there are many options on there. Tableau is probably the most professional one at the moment. But then after that, I would recommend to teach coding to students. A little bit of JavaScript or D3 or Raphael processing in some cases. Well, anyway, going back, again, anybody else? Any question? I then represented the graphic using an even less common graphic form, all right? And that is actually the cover of the book, all right? That is called a slope graph. And a slope graph is a graphic that you don't see very often in newspapers and magazines. The New York Times has used it quite a lot lately. A slope graph is usually a graphic that you use to compare the variation of a variable between 2 years, for instance. So you have an employment rate state by state, and you put 2000 here and 2010 here, and then this is a scale that goes from 0 to 15% in the case of unemployment rate. So you can compare where Texas was in 2000, where it is right now in 2010. Obviously, it works better in interactive form, where you can filter and see just one of the lines, etc., rather than in print form. But in this case, I used it just as an exercise, and I'm not saying that it would be publishable, but I used it just as an exercise to prove that in some cases, in certain cases, you can use a graphic form in an unorthodox way. Because what I did in this graphic is to actually, and again, this lacks a headline, a proper intro, etc., etc. What I did was to encode I believe that this was the, no, this is the education on the first axis, and obesity in the second axis. And what you can see, if you pay attention, you don't see it very clearly there because the resolution is not that high. But if paying attention to the graphic, you can see that the states that are very high on the first scale tend to be very low on the second scale. And the states that are down here on the first scale tend to be there on the other scale. So actually you see the inverse relationship in there. So which one I would choose if I had to create these for a publication? It would depend on the publication. I don't know. I think that this one or that one or even that one, depending on who you're working for. If you're working for the New York Times, I would probably go for this one because it's unusual and it tells the story. But if you work for a regular regional newspaper, something like that, maybe, perhaps. All right? But certainly, I would not do that in this particular case. Okay? In this particular case, in other cases, it may work. You never know until you represent the data. Okay? Until you represent the story. Now, and the last thing, the last lesson, the last thing that you have to learn or to teach your students. Create hierarchies, create structures, write a proper headline for your graphics, which is something that many students forget. Infographics are not just visuals, they are a combination of copy and visuals, and copy is equally important. That is the reason why the previous graphics didn't work that well, because they didn't have a proper headline and proper intros. And get used to not just throwing data at readers, which is something many designers do and many developers do. You have heard about bringing developers into the newsroom and bringing, designers into the newsroom, let them create those crazy visualizations that they love or that we love, etc. Well, we certainly need to do that, all right? But at the same time, we have to think about what the proper structure for the information is, have to think about what the main points of a story is, etc. What point you want to, to make, or what points, because there may be more than one, what points you want to make with your graphic. And I'm going to show you just a very quick example of a graphic that I made with my team when I was working in Brazil, which is this graphic that you see over here. All right, so let me tell you a little bit, and this is going to be the last part of the presentation. Brazil, you know that Brazil is going through a very long period of growth, economic development. But Brazilian politicians and the population in general are very concerned about the quality of education. Public education in particular is horrible in Brazil compared to private education. So many people, a lot of people in Brazil are aware of the huge gap that exists between public schools and private schools, for instance, okay? Or even between the states, the different states in Brazil. In Brazil, the southern states tend to be rich and educated, etc. And the northern states, particularly the northeast, tend to be poor and badly educated, etc. But those things have not been visually represented in any sense, or not properly, at least. So in Brazil, they have an exam that every student has to take before they get into college, called the ENEM, which is similar to, what is the one that you have to take here?
FCAT.
Yeah, exactly. So
SAT.
exactly. So they have to take the NM, all right? The NM is a test that they have to take. It's a general knowledge test, etc. Everybody takes it. Everybody that wants to access a college, etc. They take it. The government aggregates the data, and they release the data. They release the data per student, per average per school, average per state, etc. And they release all those data. And what the media usually does is just to publish long lists of schools to see what schools do well and what schools do bad. But they don't aggregate the data a little bit further to actually show you the differences in quality between the different states. So in this particular graphic that we made, and this is an interactive graphic actually, we try to address that problem. So the graphic has a headline, has an intro, and down here it has 3 or 4 explainers that tell you what you are seeing. Or what you're supposed to see. Now, what you have in this graphic over here is state by state the quality of the education of each one of those places. Each one of those bars represents the total number of schools in a state, okay? All the schools in a state together. And the line that goes across the graphic is the average score in that test. That means that the lower a bar is, the higher the number of schools that are below the average, the national average in that test. And the higher the bar is, the higher the number of schools that are above the average in that particular state. So you can see what states are doing better, what states are doing worse. There are some states that are doing great, for example, the Federal District, the DF, Brasilia, where more than half of the schools are above the average. And you have states such as Tocantins, which is a very poor state, where more than 92% of the schools are below the national average in that exam, in that test. All right, so this shows you the difference between the states. But here comes the interesting part of the graphic. We also wanted to show the difference between private and public education. And the problem, if you present just only that, is that you are putting all the schools together. You're aggregating all the schools together. So what we did was to create a filter that let readers see just public schools. And see what happens when I click just public schools. They all go down. I have never seen that before. I had never seen that before. That is the effect that you want to create in your readers. I already knew about this, but I had never seen it represented. That is evidence in the humble sense of the word, obviously. And now, if I go here and I do the opposite and I select just private, the difference is huge, right? So what is the message? Obviously the graphic has more parts, so it also has a ranking or the most 40,000 schools in Brazil. It is searchable, so you can search for a particular school, you can see the score of the school, so it has other parts, okay? But the most successful part, in my opinion, is this very simple presentation. It's really, really simple. It doesn't have anything particularly complex. It's very, it's not that hard to understand, in my opinion.
Did you
combine
those two in one chart at all?
I'm sorry?
Did you combine the public and private in one chart?
Yeah. And then we created a chart for public and another chart for private. And actually, well, they are interactive as well, so you can see the specific numbers if you roll over them. But we did more things, as I said before. The ranking, you can also see the scores in participation, etc.
But there's no way to see, say, like the number of schools. So like I see that RR1.
Yeah, there are things that are not shown in this graphic.
Really
Yeah, if we had more time, one thing that I would like to do here is some sort of histogram that shows you how many schools are outliers, how many schools are clustered, are on the mean. But we didn't have, sometimes you don't have time to do that, so you have to stick to what you have time to do. But that is an excellent point. Actually, I didn't include it in the presentation, but we created another story where we actually created those histograms, but we didn't have time to combine them with this presentation. Very good point. So at the end, I'm going to just to reach the end of the presentation, then we can talk about whatever you want. It says, show what I would not be able to see otherwise. That is the thing about graphics and visualization. Show me the evidence that I would not be able to see otherwise. And now I will take any question that you have. Go ahead.
You might have said this, I might have missed it, but what did you use to build that last?
This one?
So, yes, what,
That is Flash.
that's Flash, okay.
That is still Flash. Yeah, that is still Flash. Questions? We had many during the presentation. That was
So that
great.
could have been in a JavaScript.
Yeah, it could be JavaScript. It could be. Actually, if I had to do this again, I didn't build. By the way, I didn't do that myself. I just did for this particular project, and this is something that came up in the previous panel. You have to work in teams. So my role in the team was just to take a look at the numbers, come up with headlines, sketch ideas out in Illustrator, create the templates, create the visual mock-ups. And then I usually do that with a programmer on my side, so we were talking all the time to each other. And that is the person who actually built the infographic and who came up with the idea of adding animation because this was not my idea. The idea of having that transition, that animated transition, that was not my idea. And I think that was genius. That is what actually brings the graphic was okay, but with the animation it gets much, much better. It gets the message through very quickly.
You mentioned simple drawing tools before, because I think that sometimes the students need the carrots and the sticks, and I think it will be, you make the argument, you understand the data first, but if you hold out the carrot, then you can draw the picture of the airplane later on. What kind of introductory tools do you use for drawing?
Well, I use Illustrator, Adobe Illustrator. In my classes, the thing about the University of the School of Communication in Miami is that I don't need to teach scripting in my classes because somebody else takes care of that. So my classes deal with the conceptual side, with creating visual mock-ups, with creating sketches by hand. That is the first thing that I have students do: get a piece of paper, get a pencil, and start sketching ideas out. And then I teach them how to use Adobe Illustrator just to create visual mock-ups. And then they can get the programming in other classes. I believe that is the right process to learn those kind of things. If you teach sketching at the same time that you're teaching programming, students will tend to rush to the computer rather than thinking about the story first. That is, I may be wrong. I have not tested that idea, but that's what I feel. That's the reason why they need to sketch ideas first. And Adobe Illustrator, but you could use, Inkscape, which is the open source alternative to Illustrator, I guess, or R. If you want to only do graphs, R would be an option for that. So there are many tools. I only use Illustrator because it's what I have used in the last 15 years, and it comes naturally to me to use Illustrator.
We probably need to wrap up, but
Okay.
probably time for one or two more questions.
All right.
I think there's a value to some sort of explanatory element that would accompany a graphic like
Yeah.
this. You mentioned how many different parts there are, and there's sub-menus. Do you think there'd be a value to a video walking someone through it, or a presentation, or audio, or something?
Hans Rosling. Have you heard of Hans Rosling? Hans Rosling is a professor of public health in Sweden. And if you don't know him, just go to YouTube, look for Hans, H-A-N-S. I'm getting better at that. Rosling is R-O-S-L-I-N-G, Rosling. So look for him in YouTube, and you will see how he presents data and graphics. And when we created this graphic is not perfect for that. After creating it, I said, well, it would be wonderful to do exactly what I have done right here. Take a look at this, now filter that, now see that. So record yourself doing that at first, all right? And you put the video there showing readers how to read the graphic. And then after you show them how to read the graphic, you stay away from the graphic and you let them play with the graphic. So all graphics, in my opinion, particularly interactive graphics, come with a presentation layer, which is that you presenting the data, you writing the headline, you writing the intro, you writing how to read the graphic, or telling how to read the graphic, and you can record yourself doing that. And then you have the exploration layer of the graphic. Well, you just let readers alone, exploring the data on their own and discovering what is going on with their school, which is what many people did with this graphic. I did that because I have kids. I went to the database and I looked for the school that my kids were attending. So that is a very good question. Yeah.
So I don't know Illustrator very well. I know that Excel is a number crunching program. I have this headline in my head. You can do that in Illustrator? So is Illustrator a program that has these number crunching capabilities?
It doesn't have it is not as powerful as Excel or OpenOffice or R crunch numbers. It is not designed for that. But it certainly lets you create graphics, very effective graphics, such as the one that I presented. All the graphics that I showed, those ones, for instance, this one, that one, all those were done in Illustrator. All right?
Okay.
So you cannot crunch numbers in the sense that you cannot calculate the mean or the median or the whatever, or standard deviations in Illustrator. You still need R or Excel or OpenOffice to do that. But if your goal is just to create the graphic, Illustrator works quite well. Or a combination of both, because you could generate the graph, the basic graph in Excel, you can copy it and paste it in Illustrator, and then style it in Illustrator.
Okay.
Put the headline in there, change the colors. I sometimes do that as well. All right, well, thank you so much.